Thomas Miller had always believed in the power of routine. At 58, his life had settled into a comfortable rhythm: morning coffee with the newspaper, a day at the engineering firm where he'd worked for 27 years, and evenings with Sarah, his wife of 31 years. They'd built a life in their suburban home outside of Denver, raised 2 children who were now adults with lives of their own, and had begun planning for retirement. Their marriage wasn't perfect, fewer after 3 decades, but it was solid. Or so he thought. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Thomas's world began to unravel. He'd left work early, a rare occurrence prompted by a migraine that had been building since lunch. The house was quiet when he arrived, Sarah's car missing from the driveway. She volunteered at the community center on Tuesdays, teaching art to seniors. Another routine in their predictable lives. Thomas headed straight for the medicine cabinet, swallowing 2 pills with a glass of water before retreating to their bedroom to lie down. As he reached to set his watch on the nightstand, it slipped from his fingers, sliding beneath the bed. Muttering under his breath, he knelt down, feeling around in the darkness until his fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, a small box he didn't recognize. Curious, Thomas pulled the box out and placed it on the bed. It was a decorative wooden container, one he'd never seen before. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling a strange reluctance to open it. Something about finding a hidden box under his wife's side of the bed sent a chill through him. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and a small stack of handwritten notes. Thomas picked up the first photo, and his heart seemed to stop. It showed Sarah, her head thrown back in laughter, sitting at a restaurant table with a man Thomas had never seen before. Their hands were intertwined on the table, fingers laced together in unmistakable intimacy. "What the hell?" he whispered, his migraine forgotten as he flipped through more photos. There were pictures of Sarah and this stranger at what appeared to be a cabin by a lake, walking on a beach at sunset, and several that made Thomas's stomach turn. Intimate shots taken in what was clearly a hotel room. The dates on the back of the photos spanned the last 8 months. With trembling hands, Thomas unfolded one of the notes. The handwriting was bold, masculine. "Last weekend was heaven. I count the days until I can hold you again. Remember, 3 weeks until our trip to Aspen. I've booked the same suite, the one with the view you loved." Thomas read the note 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. His breathing became shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. The migraine that had driven him home early now seemed trivial compared to the pain blooming in his chest. He sat motionless on the edge of the bed, surrounded by evidence of his wife's betrayal, when he heard the garage door opening. Sarah was home. Thomas quickly gathered the photos and notes, shoving them back into the box. He needed time to think, to process. He slid the box back under the bed and retreated to the bathroom, locking the door behind him. Splashing cold water on his face, he stared at his reflection, a man he suddenly didn't recognize, pale and shaken. He cleared his throat. "Up here," he managed. "Just a migraine. I'm going to lie down for a bit." "Poor thing. I'll bring you some tea," she replied, her voice so normal, so caring, that it made him nauseous. Thomas lowered himself onto the edge of the bathtub, his mind racing. 31 years of marriage, and now this. Who was David? How long had it really been going on? The photos only went back 8 months, but the easy familiarity in them suggested something more established. When Sarah knocked on the bathroom door, Thomas composed himself enough to thank her for the tea and retreat to bed, claiming his migraine had worsened. She kissed his forehead, those same lips that had been on another man, and told him to rest. That night, lying beside his sleeping wife, Thomas stared at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield of memories and questions. Every business trip she'd taken in the past year, every late night at the community center, every weekend visit to her sister in Boulder, all now suspect. Had their entire life together been a lie? The next morning, Thomas called in sick, something he rarely did. He waited until Sarah left for her part-time job at the gallery before retrieving the box. This time, he methodically examined each photo and note, looking for patterns, for clues. He found a receipt for a weekend at a lodge in Breckenridge from 3 months ago. A weekend when Sarah had supposedly been at a teacher's conference. His hand shook as he opened his laptop and began searching. It didn't take long to find David Reynolds on social media, the same handsome face from the photographs, a real estate developer based in Denver. Divorced, according to his profile. Thomas felt sick as he scrolled through the man's photos, stopping at one from last Christmas, a party at what appeared to be an upscale restaurant. In the background, partially obscured, but unmistakable, was Sarah. Fa semaine. Last Christmas, when she'd told Thomas she was having dinner with colleagues from the gallery. The betrayal cut deeper with each discovery. Thomas found himself driving past David Reynolds' downtown office building during what should have been his lunch hour, sitting in his car, watching. He wasn't sure what he expected to see, but the need to know more was overwhelming. Yella. On the third day of his self-imposed surveillance, he saw them. Sarah, emerging from the building with David, his hand resting casually on the small of her back. Thomas watched as they walked to a nearby cafe, taking a table by the window. Even from a distance, he could see the easy intimacy between them, the way she leaned toward him when he spoke, the casual touch of his hand on hers. Thomas took out his phone and snapped several pictures, his hand surprisingly steady despite the storm inside him. Then he started the car and drove home, his mind made up. The time for watching and waiting was over, 6 years. That evening, when Sarah returned home, Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table, the wooden box in front of him. Under our bed. Not a very original hiding place. Thomas's voice was calm, belying the turmoil within. Who's David Reynolds? The color drained from Sarah's face. She set her purse down slowly, as if buying time. Tom, I can explain. I saw you with him today, Thomas interrupted. At Luciano's cafe. You were wearing that blue dress I bought you for our anniversary. Really? Thomas opened the box, spreading the photos across the table. Because I think my wife of 31 years has been having an affair with a real estate developer named David Reynolds. I think she's been lying to me about business trips and conferences and dinners with colleagues. I think she's been sleeping with another man in hotel rooms I paid for with my credit card points. His voice cracked on the last words. How long? He demanded, his composure finally slipping. How long has this been going on? The admission hit Thomas like a physical blow. 1.5 years of lies. Of betrayal. Of making a fool of him. Sarah looked down at her hands. I don't know if I can explain it in a way that would make sense to you. We grew apart, Tom. You were always working, always distracted. When was the last time you really looked at me? Really saw me? She wiped at her tears. David makes me feel alive again, desired, important. And I don't? Thomas felt a surge of anger. 31 years, Sarah. 2 children. A home. A life. Did none of that make you feel important? Different, Thomas repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you just going to keep lying indefinitely? Sarah didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was small. I don't know. Thomas stood up, unable to sit across from her any longer. I want you out of this house. Tonight. Reasonable? He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Was it reasonable to destroy our marriage? To throw away 3 decades like they meant nothing? Not anymore, Thomas said firmly. You can stay with your sister. Or with David. I don't care. But I can't look at you right now without wanting to scream. Sarah began to cry in earnest now. Please, Tom, we can work through this. We can get counseling. There's nothing to work through. Thomas cut her off. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah had packed a bag and gone to her sister's, though Thomas suspected she spent most of her time with David. He'd called their children, Michael, 29, and Emma, 27, and told them the bare minimum. Their mother and he were separating due to irreconcilable differences. He couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth, not yet. Thomas went through the motions at work, his colleagues sensing something was wrong, but respecting his privacy. At night, he sat in his empty house, alternating between rage and despair. He found himself staring at the photographs, torturing himself with images of Sarah's betrayal. I need to come by and get some more of my things, she said without preamble. Fine, Thomas replied. I'll be out tomorrow afternoon. You can come then. Thomas closed his eyes, fighting the urge to hang up. You've already explained. You found someone who makes you feel alive. Message received. It's more complicated than that, Sarah insisted. And there are practical matters we need to discuss. The house. Finances. She had a point, as much as he hated to admit it. Fine. Tomorrow at noon. The next day, Thomas waited in the living room, tension coiling in his stomach. When the doorbell rang at precisely noon, he took a deep breath before answering. Sarah stood on the doorstep, looking smaller somehow, her face drawn. Thomas stepped back wordlessly to let her in. Let's make this quick, Thomas replied, remaining standing as she perched on the edge of the sofa. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed. I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us. About what happened. She flinched. Yes, my affair. Tom, I know I hurt you terribly, and I'm so sorry. Both, she admitted, surprising him with her honesty. I never meant for any of this to happen. Thomas laughed bitterly. Things like this don't happen, Sarah. You made choices. Every lie, every secret meeting, every night in his bed, those were all choices. I know, she whispered. I know that. But our marriage was already in trouble, Tom. You have to admit that. Did I miss the part where we discussed our troubled marriage? Because I thought we were doing fine. Thomas paced the room, unable to stand still. Sure, we weren't ripping each other's clothes off every night, but that's normal after 30 years. We were comfortable, stable. Exactly, Sarah said. Comfortable, stable, like roommates who occasionally have sex. Thomas stopped pacing. So this is my fault? I didn't provide enough excitement, so you had to find it elsewhere? No, that's not what I'm saying. Sarah stood up, moving toward him. I'm saying we both stopped trying. We took each other for granted. The difference is, I handled it in the worst possible way. Thomas stared at her in disbelief. You think that changes anything? You think you can just say, oops, my bad, and we go back to normal? No, of course not, Sarah said quickly. I know it will take time. And work. But our marriage is worth fighting for, isn't it? 31 years, Tom. 2 beautiful children, grandchildren someday. You should have thought about that before you started sleeping with David Reynolds, Thomas said coldly. Sarah's face crumpled. I made a terrible mistake. The worst mistake of my life. But people make mistakes, Tom, even horrible ones, and sometimes they can be forgiven. Forgiveness? Thomas felt his anger rising again. You want forgiveness? After 1.5 years of lying to my face? After making a complete fool of me? Yes, Sarah said simply. Eventually. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. You don't have to decide now, she said, reaching for his hand. He pulled away. Just, don't close the door completely, please. Thomas looked at her. This woman he'd loved for more than half his life, this stranger who had betrayed him so completely, and felt nothing but exhaustion. Sarah nodded, wiping away tears. I understand. I'll stay at Diane's for now. Thomas wasn't sure he believed her, but he was too tired to argue. You should get whatever you came for. I have plans this afternoon. It was a lie, but he needed her gone. Needed to breathe without the scent of her perfume, reminding him of everything he'd lost. As she moved toward the stairs, Thomas called after her. One more thing. I'm telling the kids the truth. Not to hurt you, but because I refuse to lie to them. They deserve to know why their family is falling apart. Sarah paused, her hand on the banister. I understand, she said quietly, and continued upstairs. The weeks that followed were among the hardest of Thomas's life. He moved mechanically through his days, going to work, coming home to an empty house, forcing himself to eat and sleep. Friends called, concerned, but he kept conversations brief. He wasn't ready to share his humiliation with the world. The children had taken the news as well as could be expected. Michael had been furious with Sarah, refusing to speak to her for 2 weeks before finally agreeing to meet for coffee. Emma had cried on the phone with Thomas for an hour, then booked a flight home from Seattle to spend a weekend with him. Both had asked the same question. Was there any chance of reconciliation? Thomas had given them the same answer. He didn't know. Sarah had moved most of her clothes and personal items to her sister's house. They communicated primarily through text messages, terse exchanges about bills and mail. She had asked to meet several times, but Thomas had put her off. He wasn't ready. Instead, he channeled his pain into action. He consulted a divorce attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who laid out his options with brutal clarity. He opened new bank accounts in his name only, transferring half of their joint savings. He updated his will, removing Sarah as his primary beneficiary. Thomas had thought long and hard about how to handle the man who had slept with his wife. His first instinct had been confrontation, a fantasy of storming into the man's office and demanding satisfaction. But Thomas wasn't a violent man, and such dramatics would only make him look pathetic. No, Thomas decided, the best revenge would be more subtle, more calculated. It began with research. Thomas spent evenings combing through public records, social media, and business databases. He learned that David Reynolds' real estate development company, Mile High Properties, was in the midst of seeking approval for a major project, a luxury condominium complex on Denver's rapidly developing east side. Thomas also discovered that one of his own firm's biggest clients, Westridge Engineering, was handling the structural engineering for the project. And Thomas, as senior project manager, had considerable influence over which projects his team prioritized. Bekere. It was almost too easy. A casual conversation with Westridge's CEO about concerns regarding Mile High Properties' financial stability, a suggestion that perhaps they should diversify their partnerships. A few pointed questions about David Reynolds' history of project delays. Within 2 weeks, Westridge had quietly begun distancing themselves from Mile High Properties. Nothing overt, just delayed responses, missed meetings, and subtle expressions of concern. Thomas knew the business world well enough to recognize the beginning of a slow-motion disaster for Reynolds. He chose a Wednesday evening, when he knew from his surveillance that David typically worked late. Thomas walked into the gleaming lobby of the downtown office building, rode the elevator to the 12th floor, and asked the receptionist if Mr. Reynolds was available. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, eyeing his expensive suit with approval. "No, but I think he'll want to see me," Thomas replied with a confident smile. "Thomas Miller. Tell him it's about Sarah." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. She knew something, Thomas realized, but she picked up the phone. A moment later, she directed him to Reynolds' office. David Reynolds was younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps mid-40s, with the polished good looks of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He stood as Thomas entered, his expression guarded. "I'm sure it is," Thomas replied, closing the door behind him. "May I sit?" Thomas took his time settling into the chair, studying the man who had destroyed his marriage. "I thought it was time we met face to face." "Thomas, please. After all, you've been sleeping with my wife for over a year. I think we can dispense with formalities." Reynolds had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Sarah told me you found out. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about how this happened." "Are you?" Thomas asked mildly. "Sorry about how it happened, or sorry it happened at all?" "Angry doesn't begin to cover it," Thomas interrupted, his voice still calm. "But that's not why I'm here." Thomas smiled thinly. "To let you know that actions have consequences, Mr. Reynolds." "Not at all. Just a statement of fact." Thomas stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "You see, I've recently had some interesting conversations with the people at Westridge Engineering. They seem to have developed concerns about Mile High Properties' new project. Something about financial instability and a history of missed deadlines. I also had lunch with James Harrington at First Denver Bank last week," Thomas continued. "We play golf together occasionally. He mentioned they're reevaluating some of their real estate development loans. Economic uncertainty, you understand." Reynolds stood now too, his hands flat on his desk. "You son of a bitch. You're trying to ruin me." "No, Mr. Reynolds. I'm simply having conversations with colleagues and friends. The fact that these conversations might impact your business is unfortunate." Thomas moved toward the door. "Oh, and Sarah tells me your relationship is over. I hope that's true, for your sake. Because while I may not be able to salvage my marriage, I can certainly make your professional life extremely difficult." Thomas paused at the door. "No, it's consequences. You took something precious from me. Now you're losing something precious to you. Seems fair, doesn't it?" He left without waiting for a response, feeling a cold satisfaction that did little to ease the ache in his heart. The fallout from Sarah's affair spread like ripples in a pond, touching everyone in their shared life. Their closest friends, Mark and Diane Lawson, had been devastated by the news. They'd been a foursome for decades, vacations together, weekly dinner parties, their children growing up side by side. "I just can't believe it," Mark said one evening, sitting across from Thomas at their usual table at O'Malley's pub. It was their first time meeting since the separation, and Mark looked almost as shell-shocked as Thomas felt. Sarah, of all people. Thomas took a long pull of his beer. "Believe it, I've got the pictures to prove it." "Some days are better than others," Thomas admitted. "Work helps. Keeps my mind occupied." "Struggling. Emma's talking about postponing her wedding. Says she can't imagine celebrating while her family is falling apart." Thomas felt a fresh surge of anger at Sarah for this, for tainting even their daughter's happiness. Mark reached across the table, gripping Thomas's shoulder. "She shouldn't do that. Life goes on, even through the hard parts, maybe especially through the hard parts." Thomas nodded, grateful for his friend's steady presence. "That's what I told her. We'll see. And what about you and Sarah? Any chance of... Mark left the question hanging. Thomas stared into his beer. I don't know. Some days I think maybe, with time. Other days, I can't imagine ever trusting her again. For what it's worth, Mark said carefully, Diane and I both think what Sarah did was inexcusable. But we also know how much you two have meant to each other over the years. You know what I mean, Mark said gently. 31 years is a lot to throw away. No, you're not, Mark agreed, but you might be the one who decides whether to pick it up again. The conversation shifted to safer topics. Work, baseball, Mark's new boat. But Thomas found himself turning his friend's words over in his mind long after they'd parted ways. The social awkwardness extended beyond their immediate circle. Thomas had stopped attending the neighborhood block parties and the country club events that had once been fixtures in their calendar. He couldn't bear the pitying looks, the careful avoidance of Sarah's name, the well-meaning but painful inquiries about his well-being. Instead, he found solace in unexpected places. His Thursday night poker game, once a casual diversion, became an anchor in his week. The 5 other men, colleagues and friends from various phases of his life, never asked about Sarah unless Thomas brought her up first. They played cards, drank bourbon, and talked about everything and nothing, providing Thomas with a few hours of normalcy in his upended life. And then there was Maggie Chen, the new CFO at his firm. 15 years his junior and recently divorced herself, she had approached him after a particularly grueling budget meeting with an unexpected invitation. A bunch of us are going to that new jazz club downtown on Friday, she'd said. You should come. The saxophone player is supposed to be amazing. It's not a date, Maggie had clarified with a smile. Just colleagues unwinding after a long week, no pressure. To his own surprise, Thomas had accepted, and had found himself, for the first time in months, genuinely enjoying an evening out. Maggie and the others, all younger, all refreshingly unconnected to his life with Sarah, had talked and laughed and listened to music without a single pitying glance or awkward pause. As he'd driven home that night, Thomas had realized something important. Life was continuing, with or without Sarah. And maybe, just maybe, his life could be good again. Different, but good. Dad, I need to talk to you about the wedding, she began, her voice tentative. Thomas braced himself. You're not still thinking of postponing, are you? Because, honey, your happiness shouldn't be on hold because of what's happening between your mother and me. No, it's not that, Emma said. Jason and I still want to get married in October as planned. It's just, I don't know how to handle the ceremony. The reception. You and Mom in the same room. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling a fresh wave of pain for his daughter. What does your mother say? She says she'll do whatever makes me comfortable. That she'll understand if I don't want her to walk me down the aisle with you. The tradition had been planned long before the separation, both parents escorting their only daughter down the aisle, a symbol of their united support for her new life. There was a long pause. I want my parents, Emma said finally, her voice breaking. Both of you, like we always planned. But I don't want it to be awkward or painful for you, Dad. Thomas took a deep breath. Listen to me, Emma. Your wedding day is about you and Jason, not about me and your mother. If you want both of us to walk you down the aisle, then that's what will happen. I promise I can put aside my feelings for one day to make you happy. Absolutely sure, Thomas said firmly. Your happiness comes first. Always has. Always will. After hanging up, Thomas sat in his silent house, thinking about what he'd just promised. A day of pretending, of standing beside Sarah as if they were still a unit, still the parents who had raised their children together with love and hope. It would be excruciating. And perhaps, he thought with a sudden clarity, this was the beginning of something important, learning to redefine his relationship with Sarah, not as husband and wife, but as co-parents, as people who had once loved each other, and now needed to find a way to exist in the same world without causing more pain. Summer faded into fall, and with the changing leaves came a gradual shift in Thomas's perspective. The raw pain of betrayal had dulled to a persistent ache, present but no longer all-consuming. He had settled into a new routine. Work, regular dinners with Michael when he was in town, weekly calls with Emma as she finalized wedding plans, occasional evenings out with colleagues, including Maggie Chen. He and Sarah had established a cautious détente, communicating primarily about practical matters, the house, still unsold, finances, still entangled, and family events, increasingly frequent as Emma's wedding approached. They had met twice with their attorneys to discuss divorce proceedings, but neither had filed the final paperwork. Thomas wasn't sure why he was hesitating. Part of him still loved Sarah, despite everything. Part of him feared the finality of divorce, the admission that 31 years had ended in failure. And part of him, a part he was only beginning to acknowledge, wondered if there might be a path forward together. Sarah had been consistent in her contrition and her desire to repair their marriage. She had suggested counseling several times, had written him long letters explaining her actions and expressing her remorse. Thomas had read these letters with a mixture of anger, pain, and reluctant understanding. The portrait she painted of their marriage in the years leading up to her affair was not entirely unfamiliar. The gradual drift apart, the routine that had replaced passion, the unspoken resentments that had accumulated like dust in corners. It didn't excuse her betrayal, nothing could. But it did provide context that Thomas, in his initial shock and rage, had been unable to see. On a crisp October morning, 2 weeks before Emma's wedding, Thomas found himself driving to the small lake house they had purchased 10 years earlier. Located 2 hours outside Denver, it had been their weekend retreat, a place where they had fished and read and simply been together, away from the demands of work and social obligations. Thomas hadn't been to the lake house since discovering Sarah's affair. It held too many memories, too much of the life they had built together. But now, drawn by some impulse he couldn't quite name, he turned his car toward the mountains. The cabin looked smaller than he remembered, its blue paint faded by sun and snow. Thomas sat in the car for a long moment before getting out, breathing in the scent of pine and lake water. The key stuck in the lock, unused for months but finally turned with a reluctant click. Inside, everything was exactly as they had left it after their last weekend together in February. Dishes dried in the rack, a novel Sarah had been reading still open on the coffee table, their fishing gear stacked neatly by the door. Thomas moved through the small rooms, touching objects, remembering. On the mantel above the stone fireplace stood framed photographs, their life together captured in moments of joy. Their wedding day, Sarah radiant in white. Michael's high school graduation. Emma's college commencement. The four of them on a beach in Hawaii, sunburned and smiling. Thomas and Sarah on their 25th anniversary, renewing their vows in this very cabin, surrounded by friends and family. Thomas picked up this last photo, studying their faces. They had been happy that day, genuinely happy. He remembered the way Sarah had looked at him as they repeated their vows, her eyes bright with tears and love. Had it all been a lie? Or had something real been lost along the way? There was a pause. "Ooh," Sarah said finally. "I didn't know you still went there." Sarah was silent for so long that Thomas thought the call might have dropped. Then, "I miss it. I miss us." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the familiar mix of anger and longing. "Why did you call, Sarah?" "Emma needs us to finalize some details for the wedding, the rehearsal dinner, the seating chart. She suggested we meet for lunch tomorrow." Thomas looked again at the photograph in his hand, younger versions of themselves, happy and whole. "Yes," he said. "That's okay." After hanging up, Thomas continued his exploration of the cabin. In the small bedroom, the quilt Sarah had made for their 10th anniversary still covered the bed. In the bathroom, her shampoo still stood in the shower caddy. Everywhere he looked, evidence of their shared life. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed. He had come here seeking... what? Closure? Clarity? Whatever it was, he hadn't found it. Instead, he had found reminders of what they had been to each other, of the life they had built together, piece by piece, year by year. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows, Thomas made a decision. He would meet with Sarah and Emma tomorrow. He would continue with his plan to escort his daughter down the aisle alongside her mother. He would maintain the civil, distant relationship he and Sarah had established. But after the wedding, after Emma and Jason had departed for their honeymoon and the dust had settled, Thomas would make a choice. Either file for divorce and truly begin his life anew, or agree to Sarah's suggestion of counseling and see if there was anything left to salvage. The thought brought a strange sense of peace. For months he had been in limbo, neither moving forward nor going back. Now, at least, he had a timeline, a plan. Thomas spent one more hour at the cabin, securing windows and checking pipes before the winter set in. As he locked the door behind him, he realized he was taking something important away from this visit. Not answers, but questions. The right questions, finally. Not how can I make her pay, but how can I find peace, with or without her? The lunch with Sarah and Emma the next day was awkward, but productive. They sat at a corner table in Emma's favorite restaurant, discussing flower arrangements and table settings with forced normalcy. Emma, sensitive to the tension between her parents, did most of the talking, while Thomas and Sarah contributed when necessary, careful not to disagree or create additional stress for their daughter. As they were finishing their meals, Emma excused herself to use the restroom, leaving Thomas and Sarah alone for the first time in weeks. "She seems happy," Sarah said, watching their daughter weave through tables. "Despite everything." Sarah looked at him, surprised by what might have been a compliment. "Tom, I've been thinking. After the wedding, what comes next for us?" Sarah twisted her napkin in her hands. "I know I've suggested counseling before, and you weren't ready. I understand that, but I wanted you to know that the offer still stands. Whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready." Thomas studied her face, the face he had woken up to for more than 3 decades, the face that had aged alongside his own. There were new lines around her eyes, new shadows beneath them. She looked tired, he realized. Tired and sad and hopeful, all at once. "I went to the lake house yesterday because I needed to think," he said slowly. "About us, about what happens after Emma's wedding." "I haven't decided anything yet," Thomas continued, "but I'm considering counseling, not promising anything beyond that, just considering it." The hope in Sarah's eyes was almost painful to see. "That's all I'm asking for, Tom. A chance." Emma returned, and the moment passed. But something had shifted, subtly but significantly. A door that had been firmly closed was now, perhaps, slightly ajar. The day of Emma's wedding dawned clear and cool, the October sky a brilliant blue. Thomas stood in the church vestibule, adjusting his tie and trying to calm his nerves. Not for the ceremony itself, he had rehearsed his part thoroughly, but for the hours ahead, standing beside Sarah, presenting a united front for their daughter's sake. Sarah appeared at his elbow, elegant in a silver blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. "You look handsome," she said softly. They stood in awkward silence until Emma arrived, radiant in white lace, her eyes bright with excitement and unshed tears. "My 2 favorite people," she said, taking each of their hands. "Ready to give me away?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Never ready for that, sweetheart. But we'll do it anyway." The ceremony was perfect. Emma and Jason exchanging vows beneath an arch of autumn flowers, their voices clear and confident. Thomas felt Sarah's hand tremble in his as they responded to the minister's question. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Their voices blended as they answered together. "Her mother and I do." At the reception, Thomas fulfilled his duties as father of the bride, the welcome speech, the first dance with Emma, the toast to the newlyweds. He and Sarah moved in careful orbits around each other, polite but distant, united only in their love for their daughter. As the evening progressed and the celebration grew more relaxed, Thomas found himself at the bar, ordering a scotch. A familiar voice beside him said, "Make that 2, please." Sarah stood there, her silver blue dress catching the light, her makeup slightly smudged from happy tears during the ceremony. They sat in silence as the bartender poured their drinks. Around them, the reception continued, music playing, guests dancing, laughter and conversation filling the room. "She's so happy," Sarah said, watching Emma and Jason on the dance floor. "We did that, Tom. Whatever else we got wrong, we raised 2 amazing children." Sarah turned to face him fully. "I know this isn't the time or place, but I need to say something. I've had a lot of time to think these past months, about what I did, about why I did it, and I want you to know that it was never about not loving you." Thomas took a sip of his scotch, letting the burn distract him from the pain her words evoked. "Then what was it about, Sarah?" She looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring she still wore despite everything. "It was about feeling lost. About waking up one day and not recognizing my life or myself in it. David was a distraction, an escape, a terrible, selfish mistake." "You could have talked to me," Thomas said, the familiar anger stirring. "You could have told me you were unhappy." "I should have," Sarah agreed, "but I didn't know how. We'd stopped really talking years ago, Tom. We lived together, we raised our children together, but we stopped seeing each other. Really seeing each other." Thomas wanted to argue, to defend the life they'd built, but he found he couldn't. There was truth in what she said, uncomfortable as it was to acknowledge. "I'm not excusing what I did," Sarah continued. "Nothing could excuse that. But I want you to understand that it wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me losing myself and making the worst possible choice in trying to find my way back. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in years. The woman he had married was still there, beneath the mistakes and the pain they had caused each other. Older, sadder, but still Sarah. "I know," she replied. "I wouldn't expect you to, not right away, maybe not ever. But I want the chance to try to earn it back, day by day, for however long it takes." Before Thomas could respond, the wedding planner appeared, informing them that it was time for the cake cutting. The moment broken, they rejoined the celebration, resuming their roles as the parents of the bride. But later, as the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Thomas found himself standing beside Sarah once more, watching Emma and Jason say their goodbyes before departing for their honeymoon. "She's not a little girl anymore," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Our komolt kosnol solhessen," the word hung between them, a reminder of what they had been, what they had lost, what they might yet salvage. As Emma and Jason made their way toward the exit, showered with rose petals and well wishes, Thomas felt Sarah's hand slip into his. He didn't pull away. "One day at a time," he said quietly, not looking at her. "That's all I can promise." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "One day at a time," she repeated. "That's all I'm asking for." Outside, the October night was clear and cool, stars visible above the city lights. Emma and Jason's departure was marked by honking horns and cheers as their decorated car pulled away from the curb. Thomas and Sarah stood among the remaining guests, their hands still joined, their future uncertain but no longer entirely bleak. Thomas didn't know if they would find their way back to each other. He didn't know if the wounds of betrayal could ever fully heal, or if trust, once broken, could be rebuilt. But standing there, beneath the stars, he knew that he was ready to find out, one day at a time.